thinking that the first sentence I need to say is, why do I have the privilege to be in charge of 13 very, very serious, very high quality treatment centers for children who've been sexually abused, but why was CSA singled out more than other awful forms of trauma that exist? And I think that's what you're saying, Rachel, that your results from your survey show that we have an awful lot of traumatized children in this country. I haven't even mentioned the security system. We're just going to put that, under the table for this afternoon. But we have an awful lot of children, and we have a lot of children who are suffering from different sorts of victimization. We see it in the centers. I'll talk about it a little bit. But interestingly enough, several years ago, there was a big inter-ministry committee in the country when decisions were made about prioritization of the sorts of violence and family violence and interpersonal violence that would, hold it up for, that would be given serious government attention in terms of funding and setting up of services. And after all the different sorts of IPV were surveyed, a conscious decision was made to put child sexual abuse and the treatment of child sexual abuse at the top of the list. That doesn't mean to say that other forms of IPV are not getting a lot of services these days, whether it's centers for treatment of violence in the family. I'm looking at Ifat, who's done a lot of research in this field. Adult victims of sexual abuse, whether they were abused as adults or as children, they're also getting a lot of services. All the emergency services and different treatment services that the social welfare office is running are basically dealing with traumatized children, and most of them have been traumatized either at home or in their close surroundings. But there was a good reason why they singled out child sexual abuse as a special project, and I have the great privilege to be in charge of the centers that were set up after an interesting process that took place, so I think we'll talk about that today. How do I do this? Okay. Okay. Just a word about figures. Rachel's figures are much more impressive than mine because she went to the schools and asked everybody. Israel has mandatory reporting. You heard this before. We have mandatory reporting of almost all sexual offenses, but the sexual offenses that everybody has an absolute duty to report either to the police or to social services are offenses committed either by close family members or by people that are in charge of children, or by a wide range of family members, I said, or sexual offenses that occurred between children within school frameworks. So if there is sexual abuse between two children and they learn together in school, then this is an offense that needs to be reported. I gathered it's not the same in lots of other countries, but that's our mandatory reporting laws. And what I'm showing you here are the actual reports that we received as Child Protection Services in 2015. We've almost finished the figures for 2016, but these are 2015. And we received nearly 44,000 organized reports of suspected abuse of children, not all sexual abuse. And 4,500 of those reports related to children that were reported that they had had sexual abuse. Rachel's figures are much, much higher. But these are the reports that actually somebody identified, somebody put their responsibility behind the report, somebody sat down and wrote a report, somebody actually filled out the right forms, and I think this figure is important. It means, first of all, it means an identified child that was actually brought to the attention of either the police or the social welfare services. And they're children that, as far as I'm concerned, we now know that they have suffered sexual abuse or they had a serious suspicion of sexual abuse, and if we have decided that these children have to get treatment, then that's my base population at least. As I said, in several years ago, there was a decision, a kind of practical decision, that children of sexual abuse victims would get special services. And from 2007 onwards, there was a national initiative, an inter-ministry initiative, and there was also a big pooling of private practitioners and all the different NGOs that worked in the field of child sexual abuse and the crisis centers, and there was a lot of knowledge around in the country about child sexual abuse. Everybody kind of joined together and there was a large committee, and slowly 12 treatment centers were set up with the goal of treating every child who needs treatment for child sexual abuse. I can't remember what's on here. The idea was that we should take a disorganized service. From about 2006, we had money in the welfare ministry to pay private therapists who were recruited to treat children that had been sexually abused. That meant that if I, as a child protection officer, for instance, got a report about a child who had been sexually abused, I would find a therapist who was qualified in treatment of children who had been sexually abused. I would recruit her, I would get funding, national ministry funding, and I would be able to pay that therapist for the child to get treatment. The problems were that these therapists are few and far between. The farther you get away from the center of Israel, the fewer between the therapists became. We didn't always know exactly who was qualified and who wasn't qualified. And it was a very clinical organization, it was a very clinical setting. It meant that the child and the parents had to be capable of getting to a clinic where the therapist worked. The parents had to be capable of bringing their child at least once a week to therapy. We needed, of course, parents who were committed to bringing their children into therapy. And it also meant that the clinic was run very much like a private therapy session. There wouldn't be any kind of community involvement. Usually the therapist would see the child and that was it. And if we needed a court report, or if we needed a discussion, a multidisciplinary discussion, or if we needed extra intervention with the school or with wider family members, it would all be counted up as therapeutic sessions. I think probably enough people here work in private therapy to know that usually we count sessions, we don't count systemic work as part of the sessions. And this was always a downside of the system that we had. And we knew that sexual abuse, in order to really treat these children, needed to be a systemic approach. It needed to have space where all the professionals involved would be active and would be part of the treatment program. And also the treatment needed to be very, very accessible. We have children from all walks of life. We've seen it before this morning, that the sexual abuse is certainly not limited to one sort of socio-economic background or another. But we certainly have a lot of children who their accessibility to treatment will be a decisive factor whether they will get treatment or not. While the model was being developed, all these issues were given attention. Basically, we took the goal. The goal was to establish a nationwide chain of centers. We're a small country. We were talking about that before. So we work in terms of national services. We look at the whole country and we divide it up into pieces and we see how we can establish the same thing all over the country. I know in larger countries that's probably not the case. And the aim was to set up centers which would not only be accessible to the victims, but they would also serve as a community resource. We knew that in the professional community and certainly in the non-professional community, great difficulty in being able to deal with issues of sexual abuse, in talking to families, in talking to children, in identifying, in reporting, in explaining to parents why it's so important that the children get treatment, in explaining to the school staff why the child is upside down today because of what happened to him and he's in trauma and he needs to have his time and his space and all the rest of it. The idea was that you can't treat child victims of sexual abuse without looking at the whole system and giving the whole system the attention that it needs, and also educating particularly the professional communities around each center. The centers have been set up as a resource, and our directors here of the centers are getting phone calls all day, every day. The teacher phones up, the social worker phones up, the medical professional phones up, wanting advice, wanting to consult. What's the best way of going about things? What's the best thing to do? How to persuade the parents that treatment is important? And we give seminars and lecture days and study days as part of the program. Just a kind of more technical thing, but I think it's important if some of you are going back to your own countries and maybe something similar will be set up. The Ministry of Welfare is in charge of collecting the reports of children that have been reported to CPOs as children at risk. And I think, certainly as an ex-child protection officer, I can say that as soon as the mandatory reporting kicked in and we started getting a lot of reports, we were left with a lot of reports, a lot of children who had been uncovered, parents that knew that something had happened to their children, and almost no therapeutical services for these children. So that was the main reason why the Ministry of Welfare was involved right from the start, because we had actually piles of names of children who needed therapy and there was nowhere to refer them to. Very few mental health services under the health ministry, a few school psychology services, but very, very few and far between. And that was why the Ministry of Welfare was the leading office at the time. And the good thing about it was because there was a leading office, there was a commitment right from the start that eventually the service would be fully funded and fully taken over by the Welfare Ministry, which is what happened just over 3 years ago. The officers that were involved in setting up the centres had a very professional multidisciplinary committee. Lots of different professionals and NGOs who'd been working in the field beforehand all sat together, and basically they built a whole set of standards that actually we go by to this very day. Who are the professionals who can work in the centres? What's the basic body of knowledge and therapeutic experience that you need in order to be recognized as a therapist who can work in these centres? We have 2 representatives here of our centre in Haifa, Jonathan and Noah, and they all fix the requirements perfectly. We have art therapists in the centres as well. It's a very interesting definition of who should be allowed to work in the centre. We didn't want to miss people that knew how to get to the very soul of these children, but we also wanted to maintain very high standards, and the centres are now run by NGOs, and that means that they have to pass kind of a whole tenders committee and things, so we're kind of torn between being able to get the right sort of people into the centres to be the therapists, but also maintaining standards. We don't license therapists, but we have to make sure that there is a high standard of care because we're taking on very, very difficult cases of children that have been abused. The multidisciplinary work group also tried to tackle the issue of how long treatment should be. Remember, government ministry, somebody said to me this morning, I have the money. I don't really have the money, but certainly we had to persuade the finance ministry that we needed money to set up the centres. And there was a lot of talk about how do you build a model for the centres? How do you fund the centres? How long should a treatment be? So if I talk to the money person in my office, he says to me, oh, well, 10, 12 sessions, that should be enough. And I have to explain to him that there are some children where 10, 12 sessions is enough. No doubt about it. But I am not prepared for the girl who's been raped for 5 years before she comes to me not to sit in the centre for 1 year, 2 years, and if she needs 3 years, and if she needs 2 years when she's a little bit older. You tell a financial person how to build a financial model that suits that kind of flexibility. They don't know how to do it. So it was a kind of fight of how we built up a matrix of severity of the CSA. Also a difficult question. If there's penetration, is it more severe? Usually yes, but we never know the reaction of an individual child to what's happened to them. And also predisposition. We have a lot of children that are being referred with past victimization, past traumas, some sort of predisposition from their family settings, and their situation is much harder than a child who comes from a stronger family or a stronger personality background, but something happened in school. Of course, we tried to get the highest quality treatment possible. I think we've talked about that. I don't know whether the staff here will agree with me, but I hope they will. It's actually the model that was built is quite unusual for the Social Welfare Office. There are far more hours of supervision. There are hours of in-service training. There are hours of staff meetings. The pay is higher than most of our social welfare services. And I think it's a sign of thankfully, the development work was done outside of the welfare office, and then basically the whole financial and professional model was taken chock-a-block and incorporated into the welfare ministry, and it's important. The therapists are also paid for the hours which are not just clinical hours. The whole model was based on the fact that you have therapists who work in the center. They have time with the children, they have time with the parents, but they also have time not only for themselves, they also have time for community contacts. They will talk to the teacher and they will talk to the other family members, and it's built into the treatment program and to the way the centers are set up. Just a quick comparison, I think I said it before, the previous model of trying to find a private therapist and then negotiating how many hours and whether the child would get there or not get there. all the disadvantages of this model are very clear. You can have the presentation afterwards, Rachel, to give to anybody. Very little ability of the office and our supervisors to control or supervise what was going on. In the centres, we have a centre director, and we have also supervision from the ministry. And the NGO, of course, has their supervisory functions. And we have a much closer ability to make sure that the children are getting the service that they deserve. When it was private clinical funding, I think it can be very clear that we were missing out on a lot of that. I think what Bob, I think I'll quote you again, that the thing of the ACEs and the poly-victimization, we see quite a lot of children in the centres who it's obvious that their life is very, very difficult. When we do the first screening, we quite often have to be clear that the sexual abuse is the centre of the story at the moment, that the child is even able to cope with the fact that they've been sexually abused and is not just busy with all sorts of other very difficult things that are happening in his life. We have other services, and we certainly see the child sexual abuse treatment centres as part of a whole continuum of services. If the child is at danger at home, then they need to leave home. And if the child is having acute trauma and he needs to be in a psychiatric unit, then they'll be in a psychiatric unit. And if the child needs treatment at our centre and also he needs daycare, then he will get two services together. But we certainly know that child sexual abuse takes place in very, sometimes very, very awkward and complicated family situations, and we have to see which children we can really help, and also we have to decide whether we put a headline on each child who comes into the centre, "You have been sexually abused." So we have to be quite careful. I think the clearest example is children where there's an awful lot of neglect, and the children spend an awful lot of time downstairs under the communal block, and they're roaming around a lot, and the parents aren't attentive enough, and there's quite a high level of neglect. And then something happens with the neighbour at the next door building, something sexual. Are we dealing with sexual abuse, or are we dealing with children that are actually having quite serious problems of neglect and parental supervision? And we have to build a program with the social services that gives attention to all of those elements. I didn't say it before, but the referrals to the centres are all through social services, either after mandatory reporting, and it would be a CPO that would do the referral, or regular social workers in the local authority. And we also expect the social services to be part of the therapeutic program from beginning to end. Accompany the family, make sure that all their needs are looked after while they're in treatment. I don't want my therapist who is seeing the child for sexual abuse to be left alone with bills, debts, arrest of the father, and whatever. We need to have a systemic view of everything that's going on. I think we've pretty much mentioned that. I think the knowledge accruement, the last point on the bottom, obviously, is that since we have centres where the staff are all sitting together, learning together, having group supervision together, we're actually creating an enormous body of knowledge. As one of my directors said to me, there are things I know how to do that I didn't know 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, because all I see every day, all day, is children that have been sexually abused, and I've developed a great professional knowledge bank from that. And certainly our directors and therapists are being used for lectures, being used to teach more and more people in the country about sexual abuse. I think just some figures. Last year we saw over 1,700 different children in the centres, and we're probably seeing another 200, 250 children with the old method. We haven't finished setting up all the centres, so we still have private therapists, even though we don't like it, until the finance ministry remembers that we need some more centres to finish the countrywide setup. So we're seeing, I think, in a year, nearly 2,000 children. You remember the figure from the first slide, we were on at least 4,500. Some of whom would have gone to other treatment facilities. Not everybody, not every child who's had some background of sexual abuse will come to the centres. There's quite often other reasons and good reasons why they'd be treated somewhere else. You asked me in the break. Today, at the moment, this is the national average. We're seeing about 1/3 boys and 2/3 girls. Of course, everything we know points to the fact that boys and girls are abused at least up until the age of 14 on exactly equal percentages, and I have a feeling that in general, the figure is much closer together. I hadn't put the slide up here, but I can say that we have quite big differences between the centers. We have a center which only works with ultra-Orthodox Jewish children, and there we have over 50% boys. There is an awful lot of same-sex abuse, partly because the children are learning in same-sex educational setups, but also it seems to be something which happens in the ultra-Orthodox societies. We have a center which only treats the Arab community, and there the percentage of boys is much, much lower. We have a feeling, and my director tells me that they have a feeling that the kind of boys are allowed to do whatever they want, so they kind of roam free, and they're not as closely supervised as the girls. And I think there's a child psychologist from the school educational service that also says that the male sexual abuse in the Arab community is getting very, very neglected. It's kind of not seen as happening. And there we have a different ratio. And I think we still have one or two centers which are very, very feminist oriented. They were built up through the rape crisis centers. They see sexual abuse as a problem of women. I think it's part of the sociological changes that the country is going through. We largely have female therapists. I think as a next step, we have to decide how we attract every single child that needs our service into the service. If it's a boy, what does he need? If it's a girl, what does she need? If it's a boy who doesn't want to come to the treatment room, but he's prepared to have a Skype chat session with us, then how do we do that? We have met up recently with people that do kind of Skype treatments, and it seems to be something that certainly a certain age of young people, and particularly boys, who this whole setting of coming into a room and face-to-face and talking, and if it's a therapist or a male therapist or a female therapist, we haven't cracked everything yet, but I certainly hope that we will, and that's the situation at the moment. For the Israelis, just so that you know, the program was run originally periphery inside. So basically the whole of the north of Israel, including this area, has centers. That means there is no place in the north of Israel which doesn't have a center, professional center that the children are referred to. The big holes are in Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Givatayim, where thankfully we can find more private therapists, but it doesn't work. The number of children that we have in treatment in Tel Aviv is abominable, low. I mean, we need centers. The social workers aren't managing to deal with the system of private therapists. Ashkelon is a satellite of the center in Kiryat Malachi. All of these centers, these are the main place. Every single one of the centers runs kind of satellite centers. What I said before, that we need to make the treatment accessible. So for instance, the Beersheba Center in the Negev Desert in the south has 4 or 5 places where the therapists go to the children instead of the children coming to the therapist. And Ashkelon is one of those, yeah. I think that was what I wanted to say. There's still a lot of work to do. There's certain standards that I mentioned before. Who can be a therapist within the center? What are the basic requirements of therapy, of the training of the therapists? I think we haven't cracked anything to do with what is the ultimate treatment model. There's a lot of variation in the work that goes on in the centers. There's quite a lot of psychodynamic therapists, but there are also lots of other therapists who've learnt more behavioral approaches and more shortened approaches to treatment. As I said, we want to retain the variety. We don't want everybody to get the same package, because then we'll miss out the children that need a longer package, for instance, or they need a longer treatment. We did set up a computerized system of the files. That means that every therapist writes up all his treatments in a computerized program. And within that program, originally there was set up a way of monitoring progress of treatments. It's very, very symptom-based. My colleagues in the center say that they're pretty much finding it useless, which means that after 7 or 8 years, the therapists who are seeing day in, day out children who've been sexually abused are finding that this kind of classification according to symptoms, mainly from the world of adult victims, is not working. We need Rachel, we need some deeper work on how to measure progress of treatment, what to look for, what we should be asking at the beginning, middle and end of treatment. as my old office director said, tell me how you can tell me it's working. It was a very kind of administrator question, but I think he's right. I think we do have to have some kind of criteria for saying what's working. I think we also have to have a special way of measuring treatments of children. And I haven't found an awful lot of research on this, and we will hopefully find some more. Children like, let's say, children in process of grief, they need input at different ages because their cognitive development needs different things at different ages, which is why I quite often say to the centers, we will see a younger child for a while, and then they will feel better and the family will be stronger, and then if they get to 11 or 12 and then they're starting teenage years and they're starting to think about dating and they're starting to realize what happened to them when they were 7 or 8, then they will come back to the center and we will talk about what happened to them and the abuse and what happened to their body. We will talk to them as 12-year-olds and not just as 7 or 8-year-olds. And I think this is something that we are going to have to try and work out as a model of treatment. I think that's it. Thank you very much.